Next case study, we can see the mid-year population. We can pretty much narrow down, and that's going to be just one or two countries potentially. And see, that's essentially 1 billion, 1.3 billion people in 2015. But what we can see as far as the growth rate, very, 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 very low. Further, we look at the fertility rate. Women are having less than 2 children on average. Further, now we look at the birth rate. So the birth rate is at 12. Compare that to the death rate. We're very, very, very close. And so birth rates and death rates are almost the same. And so once again, this is going to be a good example of potentially a stage 3, maybe even a stage 4 country. So what we got going on here is we got birth rates that are coming down and almost being the same as the death rate. Go down at the bottom, net migration rate, very similar to the previous example, Brazil. You do see more people leaving the country, but it's not it's not a key clue that's showcasing, well, hell, everyone's leaving here. That's a good example of stage 2 country, and it doesn't mean a lot of people are coming there in case of a stage 4 country. So it means that pretty much this is a perfect example of another stage 3 country. So here we have our good friend China. And so China is currently at stage 3, maybe transitioning to stage 4. China is so big that it's kind of a deal where it's stage 4 in certain parts of the country, stage 3 in other parts of the country, and hell, even stage 2 in other parts of the country. So it's very, very diverse. But if we look at China as a whole, we can see some particular patterns. And so what we got is we look at the age group that's 45 years old and above. We can see a huge continued increase in population. And so this all goes back, and so if we do deductive reasoning, and so 50 years ago, okay, and so we have 2015, that takes us back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so what we have is we go back to government policy in China in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Was a guy named Mao Zedong, which what he was encouraging was to the rest of the world for China to be mighty, to have just a bigger army. It's essentially the most powerful country is the country that has the largest number of people. And so he encouraged people, breed for the motherland. And so do your duty, have as many children as possible. Then came the 1970s, particularly the late 1970s. People were like, wait a minute though, these are more mouths to feed. So that whole breed for the motherland thing was cool. How we were fighting battles, how we were doing military battles was basically who outnumbered who. Well, come the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we have new weaponry, and so it's not so much the largest wins; it's whoever has the best weapons wins. And so when we look at what happened in late 1970s, early 1980s, was a new governmental policy came into effect, and that's a guy named Deng Xiaoping, who in 1979 came up with the one-child policy in China. So what this policy was a reaction to that whole breed for the motherland idea. With the idea here, we need to have fewer children. We're having way too many kids. And so what ended up happening was in China, you can then see the results of that one-child policy, in which now you can see the inward base of the pyramid. So no longer are women having as many children as they used to. But still, although there's that one-child policy, we can see the effect of that in terms of sex ratios. In terms of sex ratios in China, because there's a preference for males, and you only get one shot, you can really see a sex ratio imbalance, especially there below the 40-year-old age groups. For example, look at the 25 to 29 age group. Look how close that blue bar is to that 65 line. But over on the right side, the pink bar for that particular age group, 25 to 29, look how far away it is. And then you go down to the bottom, the base of the pyramid, you can see how the pink doesn't even get to 39, whereas the blue does go way past the 39 million marker. And so nonetheless, we can see sex ratio imbalances here, and this is all related to a cultural preference for males in Chinese society. What's happening also is China is rapidly urbanizing. So that's another thing that explains why this is a stage 3 country transitioning into stage 4. There's a lot of demographic challenges that are presented from this in China. So what you're seeing now, look at those single males in their 20s who don't have a fellow single female in their 20s. And so when we have these different groups, not with the same, especially in that in their young 20, 30-year-old age group, that creates a huge problem. And so this is an opportunity for poor women in China to essentially marry up. Essentially, there's less supply, there's less numbers of Chinese females in that particular age group, and so they're more in demand. And so Chinese women are moving up in society quite quickly, especially from more poor, more rural areas. And so we get a rapidly urbanizing country. We can see the changes We can see all of this reflected in the population pyramid, but we can key to that, like I said, those governmental policies, the governmental role of breed for the motherland, and then Deng Xiaoping's one-child policy. Once again, we also see an echo boom, and so similarly in China, there's a baby boom that happened just a little bit later than ours, but then a subsequent, millennial boom of those that are in their 20s and 30s in China. So it's very similar in the United States in that regard. So now let's look at some results of the one-child policy in China. So what this is providing an example of a serious, hardcore analysis of a particular country. So if you're ever asked to do this in the future, use this as kind of a guide of kind of the depth that you need to get into to analyze particular patterns. So we look at the one-child policy, its effect. No doubt, fertility rate declines. So if all of a sudden the government says you must have one child, if you don't, you'll be taxed, or there'll be some type of fee, some type of penalty, then by gosh, you're going to have fewer children. And so you can see that sudden change in terms of fertility rate and subsequently birth rates. Further, because of the preference for males, there's definitely a sex ratio increase. And so what this means is in 2001, there were, in terms of births, there were 117 males for every 100 females. And so what's going on is you got a few things, and once again, the preference for males in society. If you only get one shot, you're going to then, because of view of males is higher in China, then you're going to be more likely to then have a male. So what this means is a lot of families are having abortions. So when they find out the sex of the child, if it's not what they want, i.e. female on average, then they'll just have an abortion. And so that's where the whole globalization of medical advancements might not always be a good thing. And so that's the key to that is the globalization of ultrasound technology. So it's much easier to determine the sex of a child at an earlier stage throughout the world. Further, not a lot of females are actually even reported. And so if people have kids, they just don't report them to the government. So if you have a female, you're just not going to say. So there's what they call missing females in China, in which they're there, it's just they're not calculated because they don't report them because people don't want that fine, they don't want that fee. And this is historical. This is starting to change and become no longer is the one-child policy as stringent as it used to be, but nonetheless we can see the results of it. Finally, we see the rate of old age dependency continue to increase. And so when we see the aging population of the world becoming an increasingly bigger challenge, especially in China. So when we think about China, they've got all kinds of issues. Environmental issues, they got political democracy issues, they got the role of Tibet in the country. But one key issue they have is they're going to have an increasingly aging population, and so what are they going to do about it? Especially as we go forward, by 2040, 30% of their population will be over the age of 65. What a major change that is from the 1980s when just over 5% of the population was above that age. So there's a shortage of females in China. How's that going to affect things? And so like I've already mentioned, that because of the sex ratio imbalance, there's in 2020 going to be 30 million more males than females. And 30 million is a huge number. And so it's going to create some social instability. What's going to happen when you have, especially lower income males who are single, maybe not employed, they're going to be maybe pissed off. They're going to be wanting change. And they're maybe going to be uprisings and violence and maybe even terrorism. And so that creates often social instability when you have a bunch of single males. Further, like I mentioned, poorer women can actually marry up. And so because this is kind of, harsh to, view this as supply and demand, but because there's a shorter supply of single ladies, all your single ladies, because there's a shortage of single women, that's then going to allow them to become more in demand and marry up. And so because there's a shortage of females, males often will be buying brides from North Korea, Vietnam, neighboring very, very poor countries, which women are, essentially trafficked. And so what we see, brides, sometimes child brides, which they're being used to kind of, take care of this shortage of single females in China. Another key challenge is looking at, like I said beforehand, that old age dependency ratio going forward in China. And so just to put this in perspective, the number of 60-year-olds and over will go from 143 million, about now, to 430 million by 2040. It's expected that the United States will have a population in 2040 total to be 430 million. So essentially in 2040, the same size of the United States' entirety of the population will be the number of people that are over the age of 60 in China. So 430 million people over the age of 60 is a huge problem, especially as that represents 30% of the total population. And so with this one-child policy, what's this done is it's caused a sudden change to the natural state of things, the natural flow of things. It's causing a huge problem. And so what's happening is you now have one child that's supporting two parents, which are supporting four grandparents. And so that's kind of, when you think about the pension system or the Social Security or the retirement system, that ain't a good system. To have essentially, fewer and fewer people able to support people who are retired, people who are pulling pensions, older generations. And so this is a huge population problem going forward in China, is how do you support all these old people? So like I said, we had this shrinkage in terms of fertility rates because of the one-child policy. So that what that means is more and more families are having just one child. And so what does that mean? If you know an only child, for the most part, and I'm one, I can say it, for the most part, we are a bit spoiled, but that makes sense. We're the only one. And so you're creating a generation of people who are much different than previous generations. And so what's happening in China is you're having generations that essentially all of the resources are now being put just in that one special child, where previously it was distributed to all the kids. And so what this is doing is all these resources being put in to that one child, and so it's going to be a lot of pressure, piano, math, sports, English practice, all of that, in which in the daily lives of that one child, all that investment is being spent in. And so what's happening now is because there's now this demand for all the resources in that one child, by gosh, we're going to make this child as good of a global citizen as possible. And with English becoming the world's lingua franca, more and more Chinese are seeing it advantageous to learn English, and so they're teaching their children English. And so you're seeing a lot of U.S. Americans, particularly young, recent college grads or those doing internships in the summer, who are moving to China to teach only children in China English, and paying good money because of its demand. Further, what's happening is now you're having suddenly, and this is, you think about, Chinese civilization is one of the oldest civilizations that still is in existence, in which suddenly now you're having generations that don't have any sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, and sisters-in-law. And so some of us might say that's a good thing. But for the most part, that family network, that family, the nuclear family is starting to break down. And that's just because of the effect of this one-child policy.